Many political theories work off the assumption that human beings are essentially asocial or even antisocial creatures. Thinkers as diverse as Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Nietzsche, for example, all agree on this point to a greater or lesser extent. But the idea that society originated by an agreement among essentially asocial or antisocial creatures is untenable. Frans de Waal remarks that the underlying assumption of a rational decision by inherently asocial creatures is untenable in light of what we know about the evolution of our species. Hobbes held that the state of nature was such that there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes got it wrong, spectacularly wrong. Anthropological studies have established that man's life in hunting and gathering communities wasn't solitary, wasn't particularly nasty or brutish, and it wasn't any shorter than the human average until the 19th century. There can be no doubt that the general consensus of opinion is that the move from the Old Stone Age to the New Stone Age was precipitated by the poverty, deprivation, and food insecurity of the former age compared to the relative wealth and food security of the latter. However, Marshall Sahlins is not part of this consensus. According to him, the wants of the hunter are scarce and his means plentiful. It is not that the hunters and gatherers are poor because they don't have anything, perhaps better to think of them for that reason as free. He adds, the world's most primitive people have few possessions, but they are not poor. Poverty is not a certain small amount of goods, nor is it just a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. As such, it is the invention of civilization. It has never been the case that human beings made a transition from being asocial to being social. We have always been social. We have been group living forever. Life outside the human group is not an option for man, except in the most artificial of situations that are themselves rather post-social rather than asocial. Indeed, given the length of human gestation and the dangers of human birth, together with the ridiculously long childhood of the human young, we might well be the most necessarily social of all animals. De Waal remarks that humans started out as interdependent, bonded, and unequal. We come from a long lineage of hierarchical animals for which life in groups is not an option but a survival strategy. Any zoologist would classify our species as obligatorily gregarious. Psychologically, socially, and spiritually, we are designed for life with other human beings. One of the most severe punishments that human beings have devised is exile, exclusion, or shunning. Our bodies and minds are not designed for life in the absence of others. We become hopelessly depressed without social support. Our health deteriorates. Human society is not the product of a rational convention, but of the exigencies of nature, physical nature, and human nature. Alone, man can hardly survive, let alone flourish. With others, his chances of both are much greater. More and better food, dangers more easily circumvented, the social and psychic support of companionship, and culture. Political theory is, to some extent at least, an outgrowth of our anthropology. Politics, ethics, and anthropology go hand in hand. Some see ethics as a thin veneer laid over a brutish and selfish nature, hence de Waal's term veneerism for this view. This veneeristic view of man is that he is something like a layer cake, boring and dull bread underneath and delicious icing on top, the two only adventitiously connected. Others see ethics as an outgrowth of social instincts we share with other animals. Duvall takes D.H. Huxley and Richard Dawkins as exponents of veneerism, and the Chinese philosopher Mencius and Adam Smith as exponents of the opposing school. We must distinguish between what it is to be selfish and what it is to be self-serving. Only intentional beings can be selfish, because selfishness requires knowledge, whereas both intentional and non-intentional beings can be self-serving. This being so, you cannot literally have a selfish gene. Genes just aren't the kinds of things that can be selfish. To think otherwise is to make a category mistake. Huxley's 20th century heir, Richard Dawkins, waits until the end of the selfish gene to tell us that we needn't be determined by these pesky elements. Our genes may be selfish, but we somehow are able to transcend them. In our social and political world, we don't have to be Darwinian. But if our genes are the all-powerful things they are portrayed as being by Dawkins, how is it possible that we are able to transcend them? I'm largely on Duvall's side in this debate. Veneerism is a non-starter. Dawkins' argument exemplifies the fallacy of composition, which is, our genes are selfish, so it seems that we, made up of those genes, must be selfish too. But even if our genes were selfish, and they can't be, it still wouldn't necessarily follow that we as a whole would have to be selfish also. The Chinese philosopher Mencius believed that we had a natural tendency towards the good. All men, he says, have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. He takes the example of a child in danger to illustrate his point. Quote, "When I say that all men have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others, my meaning may be illustrated thus. Even nowadays, if men suddenly see a child about to fall into a well, they will, without exception, experience a feeling of alarm and distress. They will feel so not as a ground on which they may gain the favour of the child's parents, nor as a ground on which they may seek the praise of their neighbours and friends, nor from a dislike to the reputation of having been unmoved by such a thing. From this case we may perceive that the feeling of commiseration is essential to man, that the feeling of shame and dislike is essential to man." And Adam Smith, in his theory of moral sentiments, remarks that, however selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion we feel for the misery of others, when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrows of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. For this sentiment, like all the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous or the humane, though they perhaps may feel it with the most exquisite sensibility. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it. Duvall uses the term emotional contagion to describe the induction in one member of a species of an emotional state present in another. This emotional contagion isn't quite empathy, but an earlier stage that can develop into empathy. Empathy requires an additional level of cognition. As social animals, our survival and our flourishing depend on our having the appropriate emotional responses to others. Pre-linguistic children exhibit expressions of sympathy in the appropriate circumstances. It is as natural for them to do so as it is for them to walk. Human language and human culture emerge from our proto-social connections. Once they emerge, of course, they can recursively modify, although within limits, those proto-social connections. Empathy is the original pre-linguistic form of inter-individual linkage that only secondarily has come under the influence of language and culture. So says Duvall. Emotions, then, do not necessarily conflict with reasoning. Morality has to do with the disciplining and directing, not the suppression of the emotions. Duvall points out the limitations of our spontaneous inclinations, as indeed does Adam Smith. So we favour insiders over outsiders, we favour kin rather than non-kin. And there is a universal prohibition of homicide, but only initially within the kin group, not outside it. The moral progress of humanity has been the gradual, if fitful, extension of the within kin mores to include non-kin. We might call what happens within the kin group particular universalism, for example, no in-group homicide, and what happens outside it as true universalism, no homicide at all. Given that morality is, in origin, oriented towards the in-group, it is a vector quantity. Charity begins at home. It may not end there, but it begins there. Charity not only begins at home, it ought to begin at home. Otherwise, we end up as Mrs. Jellyby, a character in Charles Dickens's Bleak House, more concerned about the state of some group of people we've never met than with our own ragged and starving children and suicidal husband. Another factor that enhances group solidarity is the real or merely perceived enmity of another group. In our own species, says Duval, nothing is more obvious than that we band together against outsiders. In the course of human evolution, out-group hostility enhanced in-group solidarity to the point that morality emerged. I'm not sure I agree fully with Duval on this point. Yes, conflict with another group tends to crush in-group differences. It's a commonplace for people to remark on how close they felt to their fellow countrymen when they were under attack during a war. Yet I don't think it leads to the emergence of morality that has to be present already. At most, it can lead to its enhancement or refinement. Morality, like language, logic, and law, is a group phenomenon. These are all embedded in and constitutive of human life, long before any of them are reflectively appropriated. If we were really isolatable individuals, morality would not be necessary. It is because we have to live with one another that morality is both possible and necessary. Morality places boundaries on behaviour, especially when interests coincide. The moral domain of action is helping or not hurting others. The non-hurting element of this claim is consistent with the libertarian non-aggression principle, and the helping element is consistent with the remainder of morality. No visitor to Earth from another planet could fail to observe and be puzzled by our propensity to kill one another. What is wrong with human beings? Is it the case that man is an aberrant biological species, an evolutionary misfit, afflicted by an endemic disorder which sets it apart from all other animal species? Arthur Koestler believes that it is a problem with the serendipitous development of the human brain, with the later neocortex sitting on top of the older brain but not being sufficiently integrated with it. He thinks that evolution blundered in what he describes as the rapid, quasi-brutal superimposition, instead of transformation, of the neocortex on the ancestral structures, and the resulting insufficient coordination between the new brain and the old, and inadequate control of the former over the latter. We have, as it were, a penthouse brain with rickety staircases and a lift that works intermittently, thus ensuring less than perfect coordination between the penthouse and the other floors of the building. Human violence is often attributed to some inbuilt tendency on the part of the individual human being to be aggressive. However, Koestler believes, and in this I think he is correct, that the human problem is not individual aggression, which accounts for only a tiny amount of the damage we do to one another, but rather our very sociability, which, wrongly placed, leads to fanaticism. He writes, "The trouble with our species is not an excess of aggression, but an excess capacity for fanatical devotion. Even a cursory glance at history should convince one that individual crimes committed for selfish motives play a quite insignificant part in the human tragedy, compared to the numbers massacred in unselfish loyalty to one's tribe, nation, dynasty, church, or political ideology, ad maiorem gloriam Dei. Homicide committed for personal reasons is a statistical rarity in all cultures, including our own. Homicide for unselfish reasons, at the risk of one's own life, is the dominant phenomenon in history." Mumford, too, denies that war is an outgrowth of some naturally aggressive instinct deeply rooted in man. Collective military aggression, he says, is as much a special invention of civilization as is the collective expression of curiosity through systematic scientific investigation. The fact that human beings are naturally curious did not lead inevitably to organized science, and the fact that they are given to anger and pugnacity was not sufficient in itself to create the institution of war. Appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, then, and despite what Hobbes has to say on the matter, human beings have been quite successful in keeping individual deviant behavior under control. For a social group to exist at all implies that the modes of social control, formal or informal, are effective. If not, the group would cease to exist. But it's a commonplace observation that persons are prepared to do things as part of a group that they would never contemplate doing if acting alone. And this degree of cooperation in destruction is possible only because of man's sociability and his possession of language. Language and ritual is what constitutes a group as a group. You have to be identified as X or Y, and that requires the telling and the believing of a story. Kessler notes that man's deadliest weapon is language. Without language, man would not be man. There would be no literature, no social life as we know it, but also no war. So it is not individual self-assertion that is responsible for man's inhumanity to man. Paradoxically, it is precisely the same attribute, what Kessler calls the integrative tendency, or what I would call self-transcendence through the social, that is respondent both for social cohesion and is also responsible for large-scale human destruction. The paradox is that the act of identification with the group is a self-transcending act, yet it reinforces the self-assertive tendencies of the group.